tung kuljetës. Shkarko aplikacionin e bankës ProCredit dhe paguaj profi nëpërmjet telefonit mobil Android. ProCredit Bank, shumë profi.
Welcome back, everyone, here at the ProCredit Bank main stage. After a few discussion panels, we're back with our next speaker, Dr. Fatbardh Veseli, Cybersecurity Manager at Capgemini. Dr. Fatbardh will walk us through the eID as an enabler for citizens and businesses, talking a bit about infrastructure opportunities and challenges. We are honored to have Dr. Veseli together here at our virtual stage, and I must remind you that this topic was also sponsored by ICT for Kosovo's Growth project. Fatbardh, thank you so much for joining us, and the virtual floor is all yours.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. I'm pretty happy to be here at KosICT 2020 after my first appearance 2 years ago, and where I had initially mentioned a little bit about this topic, and then it seems like it has triggered some attention and basically some follow projects from my talk in 2018. So I'm happy to be here again with you and to share a little more about eID and eIDAS. So I will describe the challenges with relation to architecture of eIDs, eIDs in general, and eIDAS in specific, and what opportunities come from eIDs in general, and what can we get from eIDAS, and what are general challenges that one has to tackle. I prepared a little bit more than I can cover in half an hour. So if there is an interest to follow up the topics, I have backup slides, or we can also follow this up later if needed. But for the presentation today, I will briefly describe myself and the company where I work, Capgemini or Capgemini. And then I will briefly just introduce what eIDs, what we mean by eID, and it's important for e-government. Then we come to a European regulation, eIDAS, where there is also in Kosovo there was recently also an interest to get compliance with this regulation. We will see why this is important, what are the main building blocks, and also a little bit talking just about the technical aspects, but also what is the market size, what are the main use cases for eID and eIDAS in general. Then I will briefly mention the adoption of eID with a focus in Europe, and how different architecture models basically, among other things, influence the adoption, and what do we know already from research that influences the adoption of a technology in general, and what have others found out about the adoption of eID in European countries from previous experience, then challenges, architecture models, and then finally some concluding remarks. So if there is any questions which helps you understand the topic, you can raise them anytime. Otherwise, that would be helpful if we can reserve the time in the end for questions and answers. So a little bit about myself, Fatbardh Veseli. I work at Capgemini since 2017. Capgemini is a global service and IT provider. My role is a senior, basically local business security manager, and I work in cybersecurity domain since about 10 years now, and in IT over 12 years. From my educational point of view, since my master's in information security, I followed this up also with my PhD or a doctoral degree at Goethe University in Frankfurt, where I also worked on a similar topic, which is an enabler for eIDs. Basically some specific technologies called privacy enhancing attribute-based credential systems. In my role as a consultant at Capgemini, but also previously from research, I have had the chance to work in a number of eID, but also other cybersecurity related topics. For example, ABC for trust and credential, among other things, also in technical management roles. But I also currently, in the last couple of years, I have also helped clients, mainly in the public sector, get to recognition of foreign eIDs, as we will see, and I try and I strive to continue to be basically also not just in the industry but also follow up with research activities, and I also do a little bit of teaching on the side. Capgemini is, as I mentioned, a global company with over 220,000 employees worldwide in over 40 countries. And what we do is IT, basically, so all services, IT, what you can think of. Capgemini is considered, and we also consider ourselves a leader for leaders. And as you can see, a little bit of figures, how the company has been performing last year with something about 14 billion euros revenues last year. And the average age, I think, is also important. The average young age of the employees about 33 years old last year. We have had some development this year, but anyway, we see that we are also present in a number of continents worldwide. Okay, so that's a bit about the background about me and Capgemini. Now a little bit background on the topic I'm going to present. So eID and e-government, why this is important. But before we get to the eID, I think it's important for us to just first to bring the basics. What do we understand by identity? And we hear about the word identity also in everyday life, in the context of the topic I'm going to present, and in the context of eIDs. Basically, we think and we have identities in everyday life, which, in our understanding, is a sum of certain attributes about an entity. There might be also other definitions about identity, but this is particularly interesting and cute one, I think, because it just leaves the space that we need about what kind of attributes could this potentially be. Let's say, for example, what are those attributes and what kind of entity are we talking about? And there is also an ISO standard 24760, a framework for identity management, which defines the identity as a set of attributes about an entity. And we will see an entity can be a person, and this person can be a legal person, an organization, or it can be also be a physical person, a citizen. But an entity, in the general term of an identity, we all know can be also a machine, a device, which must be identified at some point. And in everyday life, we don't just have, in everyday life, we have an identity, and in the digital sphere, we have not just one, we have more identities. That's why we also talk about partial identity. So partial identity meaning that in a particular domain, we are recognized by a certain identity service provider with a specific identity. For example, government recognizes us with a certain ID. Our social networks recognizes us with a other ID. In reality, we are one person as a person, but we have multiple identities. That's why we also talk about the concept of partial identity. Okay, about eID. I have to date not found a good definition of what eID basically is, but the main functionalities of an eID can be summarized in the following. What does it provide? It provides what we know from everyday physical world in the electronic world. So mostly we are interested to identify the entity which we are communicating with. Let's say, if this identity, usually in the eID context and in the discussion about eID, we talk about persons. The person, as I said, can be a physical or a legal person. It can also be an organization which has an identity, let's say, with a tax administration office or similar. And we might want to identify those. But we also want to authenticate, so meaning we want to make sure that they are really who they claim they are. And this is also one functionality of an eID typically. Besides this, in the digital world, in many cases, The technology that is used for identification and authentication can be tweaked to also enable an additional functionality, namely electronic signatures. So electronic signatures in order to enable us to sign a document similarly to what we would do in the physical world. And in most of the European countries, at least, the electronic signature now is also legally defined as comparable or equivalent to physical signatures. So these are some of the key functionalities of eIDs. And we might have different use cases, such as for businesses, for example, a business can use an electronic ID to register a company electronically without ever going to an office, government office or whatever makes the registration. Open a bank account. This is also, let's say, a use case for citizens or declaring taxes and so on. So some of these use cases might be for both and some might be specific, let's say, for citizens, but just to give you an overview, a feeling of what kind of use cases can be enabled by the use of eID in everyday life. Let's say a student can be enrolled at a university without ever having to go in person. And especially we see the importance of eID, I think, now with the COVID situation. I recently had to register a car myself. And if I wanted to make an appointment and go to the car registration office, basically in Frankfurt, where I live, I would have to wait a couple of weeks because of the COVID regulations. And if I wanted to do this online, I could just do it right away using my electronic ID. So these are some of the use cases. And of course, also there has been studies what are the expectations, especially, let's say, in the banking sector. This is not to say that banking has more important use case than the others, but just to give you an overview, because I found pretty much the figures very interesting, that the expectation of a customer, or about almost 60% of the customers, is that they want to have a bank account in less than an hour, ready to use. And this is and can be enabled, as we will see, with electronic ID. And most of them, they reported in a study by MuleSoft from 2 years ago, they reported that they are frustrated because they have to resubmit their data, even though they have done this previously, because processes might or technologies might not be integrated properly at the bank or when they apply for a credit card. This was a little bit background on general motivation for eID. In specific, on the policy level, we also have a so-called Declaration of Tallinn, or Tallinn Declaration on e-government, where in 2017, the European countries, European member states, agreed in Tallinn that they set up an action plan on e-government 2016-2020, and also define a so-called European interoperability framework. They also defined the main principles of e-government, such as striving to be open, efficient, and inclusive. We will see providing borderless interoperability. We will deal quite a lot with this topic in the topic of eID. Personalized, user-friendly. We will see this is also one of the challenges in many cases. And end-to-end digital. End-to-end digital meaning that we want to define the processes in the e-government sector such that we never have to go and sign a document or send a document by post, but we might do this end-to-end for both citizens and businesses. So this was, let's say, one of the political pushes, and they also defined the policy lines, such as digital by default, inclusiveness and accessibility, once only, so meaning that you just have to perform an action once, and where possible, the e-government should enable citizens and businesses not to have to go once again to resubmit your data or similar. Trustworthiness and security is also one of the goals, because in the electronics field, we all know we have, this is a very, very important part for also for the adoption, as we will see, and interoperability. Interoperability meaning, for example, especially in the EU, because most of the EU member states have own national IDs, and all of them have their own specific architecture models and so on. And in order to be able to use them cross-border, as it was previously wanted, we have to provide this interoperability layer. And last but not least, protection of personal data and privacy. Yeah, so a little bit, that was also more about the background on it. Now let's see the regulation eIDAS and what it consists of, what eIDAS is. eIDAS, maybe some of you might have heard about it, is a European regulation on electronic identification and trust services for electronic transactions in the EU. It has entered into force into 2014. And it's not just any regulation. I believe it's one of the most important regulations which has a direct impact on citizens' lives. And as I mentioned previously, I'm now being involved with KosICT, but also with the project of KosICT financed by European Union on trying to bring also the Kosovo eID basically closer to eIDAS. And we will see the main goal is to provide interoperability and transparency. The key components of eIDAS as a regulation as such, it's quite a big regulation. It has two main components. One is the eID, which we will talk about today, and the other one is e-trust services, which we will not talk about today, but it includes topics such as electronic signatures, timestamps, seals, website authentication, and so on and so on. But we will focus on the eID part. And on the eID part, we have in order to provide a European-wide interoperability, we have on the one side a mutual recognition mandate. So basically, we will see when this mutual recognition is even mandatory, and we also have because of course we want not just to accept any eID. We will see that some of them might have different kind of security levels, or let's say levels of assurance. That's why the regulation defines 3 levels of assurance, as we will see later. And it also a notification process is foreseen. So if one member state wants their eID scheme to be recognized in the EU, they have to follow a centralized process called notification process. And of course, there is also an interoperability framework which defines the technical specification which needs to be addressed in order to follow this process. So the mutual recognition is basically the foundation which enables, first of all, mobility across borders inside the European Union. Let's say a citizen of Slovenia, I took an example here, can use her Slovenian eID to get access to an e-government service in Austria. Or a business from Germany can do similarly with an eID scheme in Sweden, if there would be a similar eID scheme for businesses. And recognition, we will see notification is voluntary, but once a state has notified their scheme, recognition is then mandatory for the foreign schemes. Of course, there are some conditions. Not all schemes have to be recognized and integrated, because there is also a technical effort on member states' side. So you can imagine if you have ever had to get engaged in developing a platform for an e-government service, one of the things you want to make sure is that you want to authenticate users. And then when users get authenticated, you might want to get also different kind of electronic authentication schemes. And if you want to add an identification scheme of another country, then basically you might have to account for additional effort. But of course, if the notified eID scheme fulfills the conditions that it provides the adequate level of assurance, and it is officially recognized, then it becomes mandatory, as we will see, to recognize. The eIDAS defines 3 different levels of assurance. So the level of assurance basically tells us how, what is our confidence on the identity information supplied by the eID means. Let's say if I'm authenticating a Slovenian citizen currently on my website, how sure am I that it is the identity is really who they claim they are, but also what kind of identity means, let's say, they're using. How can I rest assured that it is really the person who the ID is issued to who is using the ID, for example. So we have a number, and we will see the regulation also defines an implementation guidance on this, but substantially we have a level of assurance low, which would be, for example, if you just provide an ID scheme with not such a high technical security solution, but maybe that would be more usable friendly, and we will see this is one of the challenges in general. And then we have substantial and high, and depending on the service you use, of course, every service provider can define and say, hey, if you want to get access to my service, you have to provide, let's say, an eID means, which is, for example, substantial or higher. Besides this, as we might imagine, in different EU member states, different eID schemes provide different data sets. So some schemes provide, for example, the gender as a data set, some that just don't. In the German eID, for example, we also have the concept of pseudonym, and this is not always the case in other schemes. So eIDAS in this case defines what is a minimal data set each eID scheme has to provide in order to get notification. And then we also have a technically attribute version profile, message formats, and also cryptographic requirements which needs to be guided, and the architecture that needs to be followed. Let's see, for example, if Kosovo would want, and of course I'm assuming now this is a fictive example because the eIDAS is at the first stage foreseen for member states of the European Union, and Kosovo is still not a member state, but assuming that this would still be possible to, I have not checked the legal aspects if this would be possible, but let's assume for now that this is possible. And on the first step, Kosovo authorities would need to submit an application to European Commission and to the member states. In this application, they have to describe their eID scheme, basically describe not just technically what the eID consists of, how the data, the credentials, the keys in that eID are protected, but also how the overall identity management scheme is organized, and the security management system basically that is set up in place, operational, and so on. So this needs to be submitted, and then there is a peer review process. In this peer review, the European Commission and the member states, newly I realized also this interoperability framework can give an opinion. They review the documentation and also the software which is submitted with the documentation. And this can take maximum 3 months. After this review, assuming this is all concluded, Kosovo might also want, let's say, to say we provide substantial or high as a level of assurance, and this is also then confirmed or not. And there is a notification, and this can happen earliest 6 months after pre-notification. When this is finished, then there is a publication in the official journal of the EU, and then from the moment of publication, 12 months after, there is a mandatory recognition within the European Union. So this is the process each country basically needs to follow in order to get to the notification process. And Kosovo eID architecture, from what I have, what I've been informed from the people who were involved in designing it, follows a similar model to the German eID model. Okay, now a little bit about the market size. And there is an estimation, or there was an estimation from 2 years ago from a study that the addressable market size for eIDAS would be in 2022 about $2.5 billion, and almost a billion users would be enabled access, and so on. So there is a high market potential. And if we see, let's say, especially we are now at the ProCredit Bank main stage. I used to work for ProCredit Bank in the beginning of my first job, and I have also, in a consultancy, been in touch with the banking sector in Germany recently, and I know that they are highly regulated. And for one of the recent regulations in the EU, for example, is the PSD2, which banks need to comply with, or also the traditional anti-money laundering directives, or know your customer, and so on. So all of these regulation requirements can be addressed by eIDAS, because eIDAS provides the basis that could be included, let's say, and if banks would also profit from integration of eIDAS in their products. There is a fictive example also if one wants to open a bank account in a foreign country in the EU, within the EU, and then just to give you a visual experience and how this could look like. If you want to open a bank account, then you get a website like this from the bank saying, okay, now tell me which is your identity service provider. Which identity from which country do you want to use? And let's say I want to use my German eID here, and this is let's say a foreign bank account, then I can just do so using the eIDAS. So what about the adoption? Adoption is very in the research is a quite well researched topic. While I was at the Goethe University Frankfurt, we used to teach as students this TAM model. Maybe some of you know it. It's quite a famous model which describes how a technology in general gets accepted by users. And according to this model, it's quite an old model from 1989. One of the two main constructs which seem to influence users into accepting technology is how much they perceive this technology as useful, or perceived usefulness, and perceived ease of use. And we will see why this is very especially important also for the eIDs. So I think it is self-explaining what we mean by usefulness. Basically, usefulness, how much the person believes that this would improve their job performance, for example, or what benefits they would provide for them, and ease of use, I think, is self-explanatory. Then we have, let's say, eID. We can consider eID as an innovation compared to the traditional way of identification with the car. So there is also on research about what are characteristics of innovations. So there has to be a relative advantage compared to what is already there. It needs to be compatible. If we want to say, let's say, in the user side, we will see why this is also seen as a barrier in many cases. It needs not to be complex. And we know from experience that eIDs, because of the aimed level of assurance to provide basically a secure environment for storing credentials and keys, and a secure environment for execution of the cryptographic operation and so on, it might not always be so easy, but complexity is not something that promotes adoption. Triability, so users want to have the chance to try this, and also needs to be observed by others. So these are some of the characteristics of innovations. And if we look at the real figures now, from a recent report from last year from McKinsey, we see, I took just some examples, I selected some examples from different countries, how much the penetration in the market of the eID basically is. Let's say in the UK, the eID is designed and implemented by the public sector, and it has less than 10% adoption. Whereas if you look at the bank ID, which is the eID scheme used in Sweden, it has around 75% adoption in the population. And this was not launched by the government, but was launched by financial institutions, but recognized by the government. And this is, I think, in the Nordic countries, in other countries also similarly. So we see that an eID scheme does not necessarily always have to be designed by the government. Then we have Estonia, which is along with Malta and some other countries, one of the examples of a high rate of adoption of eID, but not only eID. And in Estonia, the eID scheme was launched by public sector, and it's recognized both in private and public sector. If we look at the German speaking countries, I think also for Kosovo, this is very important, because as I said, to what I know, Kosovo eID is based on the German model, and we have, because of the design, I think we might have some of the similar challenges in the adoption. And we see there is a report, e-government monitor, which is published every year, and it observes how the eID, among other things, eID has been adopted in German-speaking countries. It compares Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and we see in Switzerland and in Germany, we see an uptake basically of the eID adoption compared to last year. So we have an increase of the adoption this year to almost 50% in Germany, almost 60% in Switzerland, and in Austria we see a little bit of a decrease, let's say, but it's still quite higher than in Germany. And among an interesting outcome of this study was also that 62% of smartphone users who have in reality in their everyday life an active eID, because in Germany at least when you get issued a national eID or the Personalausweis, you have to tell the authority whether you want to use the eID function or not. Because of privacy reasons, they have designed it in such a way that this is not by default turned on, but you have to say, hey, I want to turn it on and so on. So many people who have actually an active eID are not aware about the possibility to use this with their NFC chip in their mobile phone. And we will see why this is important, because it is perceived as a barrier currently. In the German eID model, you have a German card. The ID is issued on a card, similar to what we have in what we might have also. I think in Kosovo is the same, and many other countries. And you have to use this card with a card reader. And this card reader is an additional hardware which you need in order to plug it to your computer in order to be able to read the ID. And this was seen as a barrier for adoption, according to this study. And some of the people also raised concerns about security and privacy. And we know this is also, from a cultural point of view, also, I think compared at least to Nordic countries, I had the chance to live in Norway and study 2 years. It's culturally quite different with regard to the perception and attitude towards privacy and protection of data. So yeah, perceived adoption barriers. Almost 65 have an ID in card format, or 74%, and 24% of them have activated the eID function, but only 7% have a card reader plus active eID. So we see this also explains the barrier which I introduced earlier. And they mentioned here Android smartphones, because previously there was an eID solution was able to use the NFC functionality or the API offered by the NFC chip on the Android systems, but not on the iPhones, because Apple had until recently not allowed access to such an asset. But recently this has also been enabled with the new versions. So that's why the study only checked the Android at that point in time. Okay, so this was a little bit also about the adoption, and I would also like, depending on how much we stand with the time.
We actually have
and
another 2-3 minutes before we have to close.
Then if they have 2 minutes, then we have more topics to cover. I would just then basically jump to the conclusion.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So if I may conclude, one of the takeaway is that eID basically is an important enabler for e-government in any country, and it provides benefits for both citizens and businesses. Among other things, the mobility, and we have seen, as I provided also in a personal example from a COVID situation, I think this makes everything much more important to be able to perform all these e-government services online. And we didn't talk about the architecture, but the architecture basically, we have different kind of, we have 2 main kind of architecture sets. We can discuss that if there is an interest on a one-to-one basis, or if there is any question. And one of the main also recommendations is to be able to use, because in most of the countries there is a high penetration rate of mobile phones and smartphones. So this should and could be one of the design decisions for the eID in any country, and also for providing an eIDAS compatibility and notification.
Lovely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. You touched upon a few very important points and a few important processes that Kosovo is currently going through, especially with the eID. So thank you for all the information you shared with us, for your time and your availability, and we truly appreciate it. If you have nothing else to add, we'll just continue with the next panel. So thank you again, and see you next time.
As I said, if there is an interest, I'm also at this you can also connect to me one-to-one if there is any question to follow up on any of the topics. So thanks for having me, and I wish you a great day, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And for our audience, we'll be back with our next topic in just a few more minutes. Thank you so much. Stay tuned.